Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm absolutely honored to have back on the show ritual abuse, child trafficking, and governmental mind control survivor, overcomer, and whistleblower, loving mother, artist and visionary, entrepreneur, podcast host, and creator of her own incredible educational and informative YouTube channel at Desert Dakini on YouTube, podcast regular and one of our most beloved and requested guests, Carrie Olaje. In case you're new here or missed any of Carrie's incredible episodes where she walks us through her harrowing and yet inspiring testimony, here's a short recap. Carrie was born into a multi-generational incest-based family and from a young age was sold into government-sponsored child slavery and behavioral modification programs with the goal of making her a child assassin, a sex slave, a channeler, and a ritual butcher. Her abuse was perpetuated initially by her father, who then passed her on to other owners and handlers who furthered her programming, trafficking, and ritual abuse. I encourage you all to go watch the important testimony we did on our first episode together, as Carrie quite literally paints us some massive disclosures that give deeper insights into the operational and orchestrated aspects of satanic rituals and abuses that happen within these occult networks. Words truly fall short of capturing the profound privilege of hosting Carrie on this platform. Her fearless, raw, and unfiltered storytelling, woven with artistry and authenticity, delivers testimony, wisdom, and guidance that resonates with staggering impact. Carrie's podcast episodes are nothing short of groundbreaking, plunging into the depths of her lived experience, a reality so unimaginable, so incomprehensible, that it defies belief for most. Yet, through her vivid narratives and breathtaking art, she transforms the unspeakable, some of history's most heinous crimes against humanity, into visceral, undeniable truth. Her paintings that she's presented on past episodes each make a masterpiece of pain and beauty, amplifying her voice, showcasing a rare talent that makes the invisible starkly real. Carrie's vulnerability is her superpower. By baring her soul, she has crafted some of the most transformative testimony ever shared on this podcast, touching hearts, awakening souls, and leaving an unforgettable mark on every listener. Her episodes are like a lifeline, offering hope, validation, and education to those who hang on her every word. I'm endlessly grateful that Carrie has chosen this platform as a sacred space to revisit, sharing her journey and illuminating paths to healing. In past episodes, Carrie has courageously explored her personal testimony, educated us on trauma-based dissociation and mind control, the intricate workings of fostering inner cohesion for systems and parts, the chilling realities of programming and ritual abuse, and the piercing questions of how and why this happens. She shared her spiritual journey, her walk with God, and the faith that anchors her. Every episode is a masterclass in resilience, and they're all available across all platforms that I share this podcast. I highly encourage you guys to immerse yourself in all of her work here on her own YouTube channel and in every interview she's given on other channels. Today, in typical Carrie fashion, we venture into bold new territory, building on the foundations we've built on the topics of organized abuse in the past. Carrie will unravel the mechanisms of programming, offering critical context for healing and system work. She'll dive deeper into the shadowy worlds of ritual abuse, governmental and military mind control, equipping us with knowledge to confront these horrors. Carrie is a radiant walking miracle, an unstoppable force of light forged in the face of unimaginable trials and trauma. Her triumph, survival, and fearless voice are a thunderous declaration of the human spirit's unbreakable power. She stands as a beacon, illuminating the path from darkness to healing, her every word a spark that ignites hope and shatters the chains of silence. Carrie's mission to expose truth and uplift the wounded is nothing less than a divine revolution and God-given purpose, a call to rise, to fight, and to heal. We are not just fortunate, but profoundly blessed to witness her blazing courage, to be transformed by her wisdom, and to be summoned by her unyielding resolve to forge a brighter future. Carrie's testimony is a supernova, and its light will forever inspire us to overcome, to act, and to shine. Before wrapping up the introduction of today's guest, I'd love to share just a couple quick reminders and updates. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, sharing any information privately with me, or submitting a written testimony for my upcoming book series or to be featured on a Substack article, you can reach out to me via email at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com or standbysurvivors@protonmail.com. Additionally, I've teamed up with a couple of my favorite brands to offer you exclusive discount codes on products I love, like Rife Technology frequency machines and CZTL's premium methylene blue. You can find all the relevant links and codes, along with other resources, in the show notes below. Your support across all platforms is greatly appreciated, especially as I've had to shift to alternative streaming platforms such as Rumble and X following the termination of my former YouTube channel. I've just started a new YouTube channel recently, and you can subscribe to me there at the handle at Imagination Podcast Official, and I'm rebuilding that channel as well. This transition to multiple platforms is crucial to continue sharing vital information with the public and disclosure communities. Thank you all on the other side of the screen wholeheartedly for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor, whistleblower, advocate, and educator disclosures. Your support means the absolute world to me and to every guest on my show. So you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming back today's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, walking miracle, podcast host and content creator, woman of God, anti-child abuse and survivor advocate, creative, artist, overcomer, fierce mama bear, my dear friend, and a brilliant, bold, and absolutely inspiring force to be reckoned with, the one, the only, Carrie Olaje. Carrie, welcome back. It's so good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Man, your intros, like always, but especially this time, will like almost bring me to tears. It's very, it's what I think a lot of survivors need is to feel, seen at a certain point, and it's something that you're a beautiful speaker and a beautiful writer, and I just have to thank you always for doing what you do to like honor survivors and like their walk, in healing, disclosure, etc. It's just really beautiful, and you're an amazing person, like which many people that watch your podcast already know.
And so are you. You deserve every word and then some. And it's an honor to get to write these. I always look at every testimony on here and it's like, this is all stuff that none of us should have ever heard from
Yeah.
you. And so it's so amazing that this has finally reached a point in time where like we can have these conversations openly and we can spread the word on the internet and like come together in totally different parts of the world or in the same country, and have these conversations. It's incredible. And so I'm always really honored, and especially having somebody like you come on who's been on multiple times. If people are new here, Carrie has a whole library of episodes she's done on here, like how I said in the intro. And I would absolutely encourage you guys to go listen to her work here on other platforms and on her channel. It's just always groundbreaking what she has to offer. But my whole audience really appreciates you. And, as you know, before my YouTube channel got nuked, you had the most popular videos on my channel. And at the new year, I'd get an alert like your top guests on your show or your top episodes. And it was always you. So obviously you have a calling that you are basking in right now, and you're following that path and people are listening, and it really is incredible how you're able to articulate such hard information. You've been such an instrument in my own learning with this. I've resonated so much with how you typically pair your testimony with visuals, and then these really creative ways that you've learned to speak about these really hard things that can be just like almost too incomprehensible if you just hear it the wrong way. It can be so hard to even like comprehend like that this stuff exists, and then to try to wrap your mind around it, and somehow you can turn it into this really palatable bit of information and it's like, oh, like this light bulb goes off and I'm like, oh, I get it now, and I know you've done that for a lot of people. And so I know today's going to be no different. And, we're going to be building on our previous conversations, which doesn't mean that, if you're new here and you haven't listened to Carrie's older episodes, or even if you've listened to just a couple, but not all of them, it's not a requirement that you guys hear them. I just do encourage you guys to go listen. But we're just going to, every time Carrie comes on, she sort of builds on what she's already presented and presents some new information that can sort of elevate your own learning and elevate her testimony and sort of just dig a little bit deeper every time. So today we're actually going to be talking about programming and healing. And Carrie felt really passionately that these two things go strongly together. And so I wanted to just have you maybe give an overview of this pairing that we're going to be talking about today, and maybe some bullet points on, the different topics that we'll be interweaving into this.
Thank you so much, Emma. Um, yeah, it means a lot to get like your feedback and insight on that because it makes me feel way better about continuing to do what I do because ultimately the point of my channel and the like one of the points of me coming on and talking with you initially and sharing my testimony was really to try and give back to the survivor community, especially like new people new in healing, that are like, which is how I found your podcast. I wasn't new in healing in general, but when I started dealing with like the ritual abuse memories, trafficking memories I'd already been dealing with for several years, but it was so hard to find anyone that, was sharing about their experience, so you feel less alone. It was really difficult. And that's been, one of my main goal of my channel, is just to give uh, try my hardest to simplify things that are like very complex for like a survivor who has lived it to learn and untangle, and then also all the allies out there that are actually interested in learning about, trauma-based like programming and organized child abuse, like what exactly all of this entails in a way that's, hopefully both palatable and also understandable to like the layman without, having read a million books, and gone to a million therapists that specialize in dissociation or crap like that, so that means a lot, that I really I really strive to make my stuff understandable to like the beginner. And that's a lot of how I've gotten where I've gotten to in healing over the years is me getting used to dealing with child parts and learning how to like bring them into the present, learning how to heal this massive trauma that we went through as children and, make it understandable to them versus just trying to force our way into healing, just get over it, just process it. It's like that's not not the approach that tends to work. Um so yeah, so healing and and programming, they do really go 100% hand in hand because like that is literally your mechanism for healing. If you've been through, ritualized abuse, organized abuse in some fashion as a child, like that, we're not talking about dissociation that is just the natural defense mechanism that any child or even, teens, adults, et cetera, have when you're going through a very traumatic episode. Many people have car accidents and then, are in the hospital and you don't remember like this whole, the details of this whole event until later. Or war, survivors of war, basically, people can understand flashbacks that they go through and, the stereotypical like hiding under the table and thinking the bombs are still being, dropped or and a lot of suppressed grief and stuff like that. And it's the same thing we have to deal with as survivors, but from, a long period of time when we were a child. And the organized stuff basically adds on an additional level of the fact that our abusers this isn't something that just naturally happened because of abuse in like the home or something, but it's essentially something that was purposely and very specifically orchestrated to create, to use that defense mechanism of dissociation against us and to really have a handle on how they're the system of the survivor is crafted. It's not just naturally coming out of our own imagination as a child. It's essentially being messed with, being fucked with by the handlers to be molded in the way that they want, both for ensuring, the levels of dissociation and secrecy from the survivor themselves and others, but then also so that they themselves can have, codified access, triggers, etc., so that they can control the switching, not just the internal system, but the switching as well. So if you are a victim of ritualized abuse and organized abuse, you know military, Masonic, Druidic, Jewish, Catholic, etc., then essentially it's like what you're doing in healing is you're deprogramming. You're having to actually work through these different layers of crafted, you know, alters, parts, layers of, crafted internal worlds, structures and stuff like that. Work through triggers, many defense mechanisms that are laid in almost like booby traps in that survivor system to prevent them from healing. All of this stuff is very hard to, if you're just trying to deal with a horrible trauma memory, it's one thing, but it's another thing if you're also having to like literally fighting against yourself because you're working against programming to do these things. So having some context for what's going on in your head, and especially for people that have no experience with this but just want to learn about it, how they can really conceptualize how you create this form of mental slavery, this ability for there to be different dissociative parts, but then them also to like work against your best interest in many ways, is it's hard to conceptualize until you can kind of have the concepts broken down and gone through, because it's vast. There's a lot of aspects of it, and there's been a lot of, from the abuser's side, there's been a lot of time, money, effort, a lot of expenditure of people they saw as expendable, all this stuff to really kind of study and systematize this into a way that they create an unbreakable, think that they're creating an unbreakable prison, which obviously in my case and many others, it's not. You are able to work your way through it. And so that's the other message, is hope, that you're not, even if you've gone through this amount of crap, that you're not unfixable. You're not past being able to heal and live like a happy, less, less painful life, basically.
And I really appreciate you talking about this topic because I think now we're at the point where there are more people who are aware, just as a generality, that there is something happening where um, adults are using children to carry out certain tasks and certain roles for them, and it can be really confusing to think about that, like what do they mean program? Like how do you program somebody? Because it's so just out of the realm of what, we've really learned about what a human being is capable of. And even with our brains, like most therapists aren't even taught about this. They have to sort of go out of their way to research what this stuff is too. So I think it really is important to sort of lay out what this looks like, especially like during the lifespan of, a child or a human that goes through this type of training, through this type of like systematized abuse, through this type of splitting where it does create fractured parts in a person, to re-educate people on, why this happens and how. This program, it does start really early when they start doing this to a child. And I know that your experiences have to do with multiple different types of programming, which I'm really grateful that you're willing to talk about because we've had certain types of programming talked on here, but we haven't gone super deep into more the military side. Some of the druidic stuff that you have went through, you have some very specific and also really broad experiences that I think a lot of survivors will be able to relate to or learn from or take something from. And it also adds a different dynamic for non-survivors to learn from you sort of what goes into this and, kind of during the lifespan of a person, how this works and internally, and then what they're doing externally to help facilitate that. So maybe if you wouldn't mind, sort of just, I know it's just from your experience and it doesn't mean everybody has the same exact experience, but could you maybe outline sort of how this works from the beginning. When does this typically start? Whenever they start initiating these types of systematized abuses on a child, and especially in your case, when did this start in your life?
Yeah. So for everyone is going to be different. A lot of bloodline people seem like they've gone through a lot of stuff in the womb, and everything, and that's part of why, like you were saying, other people have shared about different kinds of programming. I'm just going to share my experience with my crossovers and stuff. So if you're a survivor that's new in this, don't think necessarily everything I'm saying, if you have some things that are similar, don't think that everything is the same, because it's not. It's very individual to your handlers, I think, and also to like your chosen roles and in your occult program side of your life. If they're doing this, it's like they're doing it to create an asset of, of an occult kind, of a pornography kind, of a violence related kind. There's a reason that they're going through these lengths. They have access to plenty of victims, but this is basically trying to intentionally craft someone to be a certain way. So with my stuff, I had multiple roles early on, and I think they shift a little bit depending on as you jump through, certain hoops, certain trauma instances that they put you in, a lot of different testing throughout the years. It kind of molds what direction they're going to, what you have most that they can exploit, basically, and some people have certain strengths, other people don't. So for myself, like my earliest programming, as far as I'm aware, was when I was around like 2.5, 3. That's two is when the initial groundwork is like laid for like the dissociative system, as far as like my dad molesting me. Um, that's gonna create like the initial split that most all programming is going to be based off of, is going to be betrayal by a caregiver, in my experience. Like it's what necessitates that initial early split. It's the first trauma that you're going through, for one. So that's why, part of why it's going to be the most impactful for the child. But also, in addition to that, it's, you're put in a dilemma where you're like, okay, I 95% of the time have to be around this person and be like, and trust them and rely on them for my food and for my shelter and for protection, from wild beasts and shit like that. It's like, it's very evolutionary, that that's all of this program is mostly a manipulation of our attachment, essentially. Um, so we're trying to build attachment as a small child, as a toddler. And that first time that you get molested, especially if it's by a caregiver, you're going to have this basic, you know, initial split created in your mind where you're going to be like, okay, there needs to be the version of me that can deal with this person like a father child relationship. And then you're going to have this version of me that is going to like completely wall off that identity, and vice versa, where it's like you have to see this person as a horrible, dangerous threat that's giving you a lot of emotional and physical pain. You're dealing with feelings of abandonment, a lot of really overwhelming things that, would essentially like mentally destroy a child. You have in this other part of you that switches into the consciousness whenever, especially because this is often repeated, whenever you are experiencing that trauma, to wall it off. And that part of you, abuse is very normalized and is something that you just know you have to, survive in one way or another. That's where fight, flight, fawn, freeze, all these different reactions to a threat come in. If you're a small child and you have no hope of doing much of anything, it's like a lot of times you're going to have all of these activated at one time or another, depending on the trap or the the trauma event, essentially. minus flight most of the time. That is just a trauma response that does get weaponized a lot of times, like later on, kind of like flight and fight. So basically, because those are suppressed, not your ability, these often are like the trauma responses that will later get turned into your violent parts. All that suppressed fight, urge, and rage that you couldn't direct outwards where it belonged. And then also the flight, so flight, so being able to escape, run, like they definitely weaponize these things. But in the initial split, it's all about having that initial caregiver betrayal that then everything is built on. So when I was still in Washington, D.C., basically it's like my dad was taking me to hospital to basically Walter Reed, where essentially I'd gone over another episode, a lot of initial like imprinting of sexual function, a lot of times being tied to the end of pain, and also I was going to say the initial imprinting with who was going to be my future handler. So that was one of my roles, was that I was, a sex slave for a very specific man. I've mentioned him before, Julius William Gates. And there's in my experience, a lot of initial stuff that went on just like in a military hospital without him even being there, but just being shown photos of him, video of him, so that later on when I was put into a trauma event where he rescued me from it, that trauma bonding was really sealed because I already had parts subconsciously that recognized him, that had seen him as tied to like romantic pleasure and end of pain, safety, etc. And then early occult training, which also happened there, which pretty much was what propelled me into, the more oracle-y, black mothery, coven type, um, more like magic working occult ritual type stuff, basically, which was, being trained to be uh, essentially dissociate and be like a channel for them, which also happened Washington D.C. And that's another thing that I've mentioned before. It's like you survive basically them waterboarding you, as a toddler, and are able to jump through this hoop that they've put in front of you, but also shown that you can survive it physically and then mentally you can dissociate it. It's going to put you into these paths, which then create further splits from that initial one that are very specific to the traumas that you're going through repeatedly. Sorry, does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes. Now, what's the importance or significance of them doing this at such a young age versus taking a teenager and doing this, or an adult even, and trying to inflict these types of traumas on them?
Well, I mean, anyone who has kids will know that you can convince a child of anything, and the younger they are, the easier it is, and that's what a lot of this is using our imaginations against us. And when you're very young, you don't have a real distinction quite as much between your subconscious and your conscious, and you don't have as much ability to distinguish between reality versus fantasy, or you don't have any context with the world in general to know, like, hey, maybe this certain things are abnormal. So that's a lot of it for sure, is because you're trying to get children when they're forming their imagination, when they're forming their identity, because that's what they're trying to have complete control over. So you don't want to necessarily have an identity you already have to erase. It's like you want to be there at the beginning. And because it's, mentioning not being able to tell fiction from reality, different stuff like that. It's like it's very based on like this is, it's seen as dissociative disorder, but on a certain level, it's like it's a developmental, disorder that comes from these traumas being repeated on you. Is that it needs to happen to a developing brain to entrain these thought patterns, to entrain these mental defense mechanisms that they're going to exploit more and more as you get older and older.
Absolutely. Yes. Because I think too, there's people that wonder that, especially because when you hear about anything having to do with, say, MK Ultra in anything mainstream or even on YouTube videos, you mostly only hear of, I should say, you really only hear of experiments that they were doing on adults. And I think people equate these types of things to, oh, these were consenting adults that decided they wanted to volunteer themselves to take LSD and ended up having sort of these experiments gone wrong. And so whenever then they're confronted with a survivor testimony or hearing something different from that narrative, that can be sort of conflicting, I think, for society to be like, why are they using children? Like I thought adults would be, they were using consenting adults. Why would they have to use children? But that makes perfect sense. A child doesn't have their personality fully developed. And it is just like a kid can believe in Santa Claus for so long. You look at an example like that almost everybody that probably didn't go through this can relate to in a way, and how devastating and how earth-shattering that can be to find out that wasn't true because it was like your reality, your imagination. You thought elves were like watching you and Santa Claus is watching you whenever you're little, and then all of a sudden you sort of find out that was a constructed reality for you that you were told so often that you ended up believing it. And so you can sort of relate to it in that way, but it is, it makes perfect sense why children would be targeted. And I think too, the other thing is people trying to understand some of these types of abuses. And that really, it's like you said, like this is training. This is a system. It's orchestrated abuse. It's pre-planned. Like there's already a plan for you before you're even born. They know when they're gonna inflict sort of the first splits and abuses. They know how to do it. It's like a very systematic thing, even down to like the incest. There's nothing that hurts a child more than that relationship being broke between their caregivers and the people that they need. Not that it wouldn't be painful with strangers too, but like you said, that bond that child has and that attachment to have that shattered in that way, where the person that you need the most that you depend on is also hurting you, it can be such a big conflict in a child. And so you can see how that would be sort of a clean slate to start that process, of a child that doesn't have the conceptualization or even the vocabulary to be able to guide themselves through that. And it's really scary to think that, this stuff is that systematized where it's not even necessarily always like fetishized, where people are like, enjoying it. It's almost like a science, like, oh, we just got to do this at this age. And of course there's sickos in here, and your story illustrates that. There's like very disgusting psychopathic people that are involved with this, but even innocent people are brainwashed and, coerced to inflict harm on others and to perpetuate abuse, and you really can't do that without starting somebody young, just like how, you train a kid for sports or something. It's like these people kind of look at it in the same way, like, oh, there's this step and then this step and then this step, and then here's the result at the end. And so for you, you were put into these different pathways. So in your own experience, how and why were you chosen for these specific things, such as, the military stuff and more the channeler? Did they do tests on you and things like that, or how did you get chosen for those pathways?
Um, yeah, so one thing I would like to say is, totally true. Like all of my programming in Washington, D.C. was like, it was like nurses and doctors and stuff like that that were initiating that, like, and it was very clinical. It was very like, yeah, it's like it seemed like one of the doctors was getting off on stuff, but it's like almost like everyone else was just like, well, this is my job. You know what I mean? Like molesting children and like electroshocking children and doing all this like horrible stuff. It was very, unemotional, as opposed to like if you're looking at like a trafficking event or something like that. And then the other thing that I wanted to comment on based off of like what you were saying is that's one of the things that I think is like the most shocking, um, but also like the most important thing for people to wrap their heads around. It is that like most of the time these people's handlers are going to be one of their parents, like that. It's like most survivor stories I've heard are very similar to my own, where it's not you're not getting kidnapped, you're not getting, it's not like, it's not people outside of the family. It's usually, and like we said, it goes back to the early attachment trauma thing, that it's like the incest is the basis for this, but also throughout that child's life, into adulthood, sometimes, that same parent is like one of their main handlers, is there to ensure for, the organized crime system, for the cult, for whoever it is they're dealing with, to that it's like that they're a handler in the person's life, essentially, and they're there to re-traumatize them, re-trigger them, keep an eye on them, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's like one of the things that people have the hardest time wrapping their heads around. Essentially, they think it's all foster kids or orphan, or it's like, no, it's like it's almost always the parents, essentially. It's a necessary ingredient and a very convenient ingredient in this equation for the people that are doing this in an organized fashion. Um, but also that's part of like why I was chosen, it's like you're saying, it's like on a certain level, it's because my dad was a pedophile and into snuff pornography, himself was like a freaking sociopath. So because of that, they were on a certain level like more inclined to put me on a path too that encouraged like the violent, the unemotional, unempathetic part of me, because it is, that's part of why it's program monarch, is because it's looking at, you know based off monarch butterflies, the generational imprinting of things, so my mom was, and I think this is a lot of, why she was chosen in the military, possibly chosen for my dad specifically for this purpose, was having me, is that and she's also just the kind of person that someone who's a sociopath, like, total psychopath, like my dad, would be after, is someone that's, a victim, easily moldable, intimidatable, and all that fun stuff, that she was a product of generational incest. My father also a product of that, as well as having a father that was like an alcoholic and definitely a pedophile himself, essentially, and then it's like in part some of what I was chosen for was because of my dad's strengths, and his, asset, being valuable to the community, the organized crime, because he himself was a psychopath, and they're fairly simple and easy to manipulate, with their, fucked up illegal desires, and just dangling, power in front of them. It's like, and that's a lot of it, is like, okay, if they're willing to do this to their own daughter, they're most likely going to be willing to, like, then allow others to do it. So from that aspect, that was definitely part of it, and the other aspects is really like that, they are, not everyone is going to respond in the ways that they do to the scenarios that they're put through, when, um, with the channeling thing, it was like I mentioned before, it was just because I could do it to a degree, that it's like after being waterboarded enough, that it's like they were able to either actually channel or just have me, tap into collective consciousness type of thing, to switch into a part that was able to give them reasonable enough answers to the different things they would be asking, things that I should have no knowledge about, basically. So that's one aspect of it. But then also it really is going into testing and into seeing like what a particular child's talents are. No one knew that I was going to be like a professional artist at 3. You know what I mean? So things change as you move along, but they see like what your aptitudes are. So for myself, it's like I was, very, had a lot of, um, dexterity and, good memory recall, different things that were important for being able to be on like the butcher side of things, be able to learn, anatomy, a lot of being able to just from the initial testing, being able to create these dissociative splits where, one could be molded in a certain area that essentially, it's like you have a huge survival motivation essentially, and being like, okay, if we put her in this scenario, um, like mentioned before, like early on in school when I was 5, doing tests with like string, having to untangle different either balls of string or different colors of string basically, and that is like they would start off just can she do it? At that point you're with a bunch of other kids, and then it's like once you show that you can, they amp up the intensity of the environment that you're in. And essentially, for me, it's like at a certain point they were playing, horror. Like, first, it's just rock music, it's just very loud and overwhelming. But then it's like then playing sounds of like people and animal like being tortured or dying or stuff like that, and being like, okay, like you're still, you're alone in a room, and essentially, two-way mirror, like small room in like a hospital type setting. This was in Texas, but essentially, it's like each time it's like you already have this part that's trained physically to do this simple task, but it's like each time they're amping up the intensity of it to like really like train that one specific dissociative split into being able to focus on a task despite hearing certain things, like a human or animal, like like being tortured or expressing pain, and you have this part that's already from a very young age is able to like tune all that stuff out, like you're deaf, and just focus on the task at hand, and even being able to get to the point where they can blindfold you or have it be dark and you're, still able to do it. And a lot of that for me, was very early training for the butchery stuff, like I mentioned, because it's like ritual type stuff. It's like you have a part of you that feels completely dehumanized, like a tool, like a pure, like if you could embody being able to complete a task, that it's literally very robotic. It's very like, you run this program on a computer that's like running a program in a survivor, that you press this and then you get this outcome, so you can input, we're looking for a liver, or something like that. And it's like you could be in the dark, in firelight, in, having all this horrible stuff going on around you, or, the victim themselves, and it's like you're not even a person. You're not even hearing it. You're like literally just like a machine or a hammer you pick off the shelf, and you're just like, okay, do this thing, and and there's no resistance there essentially, and it takes like many sessions in my experience of this stuff to create that basically. So also my dad was obsessed with the medical stuff, so he was more than happy to like, that was his field. He was more than happy to, always have anatomy books around and to be, kind of talking, on a normal front life side of things. It was very normalized that, if there was a little bleed through of this information, that it was just, was just my parents being in the medical field essentially. Um, so, and then, yeah, and then there was other times where I failed this test too, like it's like, um, certain like psychic type stuff, were things that they were looking for, being able to be a psychic warrior type stuff, like where you can hurt people with your mind or infiltrate people's mind, all this kind of crap, it's like I was tested for. I brought up some of this kind of stuff in the Gate episode we talked about, where I was at the aquarium. That whole event was a testing event for certain things, and it's like I was able to do some things, wasn't able to do most things though, and that kind of determines what route you were able to go in. But a lot of like the violent side of things, really was um, early like torture and like imprinting on like the fact that you're not a human, that you yourself are like a predator animal, to where your mindset in those parts is completely that, and you can essentially be in that mindset of like, okay, it's the way a tiger would behave towards a human or something, or a wolf would behave towards like a human. That it's something like where you just see them as prey essentially. And there was a lot of early programming that went very benignly into being, pretending to be a dog. And then they incorporate bestiality, and that's where you get a lot of the trauma. And then identifying with dogs because they're still nicer than any of your like abusers. But then it's like at a certain point, it's like you're in, being kept in a kennel and being trained to identify as a dog and kill kittens and stuff, as the first step to being able to then be more and more violent with larger creatures, or more like you've already killed a lot of animals unfortunately as a child before they ever put a human in front of you. So it's really like breaking down, like people can think of training animals, training their dogs or something like that. It's almost, it's very very similar. What they're doing is, um, when you've got specific altars pulled out, it's like you have like a training agenda for each altar that has its different identities, its different skills and everything. And that's like what most of these events are patterned around.
I wanted to ask, I want to dive into and start getting into sort of the layering of how they create a system and maybe hearing it from you, kind of what that is and the functionality of some of these parts and some of their roles. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you kind of the difference between, so we have it's all ritual abuse, but we have sort of the quote unquote satanic ritual abuse side where you have these big events and they're horrifying. It's usually a lot of, adults getting together and dressing up. It can be at different locations, sometimes outside, and there's often, a lot of mess and a lot of really degrading, disgusting, and, horrifying things that happen. And then on the other end, you mentioned sort of this more clinical side of this where you're around doctors, you're in a sort of a sterile environment like a hospital. I wanted to maybe just ask you kind of the difference between the types of programming that happen in each environment and maybe their functionality, why have these sort of different types of events and programming and in your experiences, some of the differences for people to kind of relate why they're doing these in these different environments and with these different types of people.
Yeah. So it's all going to be about like the particular identities they're trying to craft in the survivor. You can really see each trauma event as essentially a giant play that's like, despite the trauma, despite all that stuff, it's like it's supposed to create, you're super suggestible when you're dealing with dissociation and, being in a trauma state. And the, set and setting, like the things that are going on around you are really going to craft the identity of the altar that's formed at the time. So, we wouldn't be creating like a altar that feels allied with the goddess and some like occult power in like a medical setting, or even just, a like bunker type thing, which I've been in a bunch, like you would want to essentially have all of the trappings of that would really reinforce that identity for that person. So for me, for sure, it's like anything that dealt with occult, like the occult side of the identities, was was entrained in like rituals essentially. Um, Caveat here because I'm realizing there is a little bit of bleed over because my handler was military, but he was also of like the druidic persuasion. So when I was in isolated facilities that were specifically, meant for programming type scenarios, trauma event scenarios, there would be some initial training, like I said, with with being able to like have the like more veterinary area at the kennel, being able to bring in like dead animals or cadavers, to actually be in training those like tool parts to do what they wanted, because you don't have a whole lot of time in a ritual, for example, to be like in training a person on like, going over the like all the details that you need to remember. It's that is its own play also for the spectators, basically. So I did have some initial training for the butchery side of things that were in non-ritual settings, but really they were like the parts that controlled those hierarchies, that controlled the cult allied part of my system. All of those parts were created in very, you know, very fantasy-esque kind of scenarios. For me, almost all the rituals took place outside. So it was very like much like a satanic version of like nature worship is what I personally was raised in. So for the occult parts of my system, everything they had encountered had been very medieval, very Ren fairy, like what people wore. My handler himself, would dress the part in those kind of scenarios. But for the most part, it was actually the occult side of things were taken care of by other women, essentially, that were like seen as like that I was a young entrant into like the order that they were all a part of, so a lot of what you're going to be going through there is like the one of the main mechanisms of creating this like programming these allied parts in the system is like Stockholm syndrome. You can't escape, but your abusers do a lot of things to trauma bond with you. So that's you're going through rituals, but also afterwards you're being given a lot of praise, a lot of feeling like like you're special, you belong with us, with a family, and you've already been betrayed by like one family. So on a certain level, for that kid, they're going to be like, well, maybe these people are better because you've dissociated into pain holding parts, like the worst parts of the ritual, and you're just like, well, I had this role and it's something I should feel proud of and everything. On the other end of things, when we're dealing with like the military side of stuff, what you're going to be getting out of that programming is soldiers, essentially. So you're going to be. It's like I was always taken. For example, the kennel was like a really big part of like programming multiple different parts. And it was almost like if people picture like middle school, you have like different periods of classes. It's like my day would essentially be split up between training different parts. So occult stuff was always taken offsite most of the time to a ritual. And then there would be time spent in the kennel training, dog and wolf kind of altars. And then there would be times where we would be taken out of the kennel and brought to like more of, like a military style obstacle course type of thing, where that was more of like a training ground where you're getting parts that are with the military training that are essentially being trained just everything you can imagine, basic training, all that kind of stuff for an adult, where they break down their personality and they make them feel one of them. And um, you give praise when it's available, really reinforcing that idea of order following and hierarchy, and not questioning, just not questioning authority, essentially. Like that's all the stuff they would put into like the military side of things, where it's basically just really reinforcing in that child, for those abuser allied parts, that essentially I don't feel pain, I don't feel emotion. I have, I'm a warrior, I'm a brother in all of this kind of stuff. For me, several of the parts, especially the hierarchy parts, were male when it came to the military side of things. That's a lot of what we were taught to, characteristics we were taught to identify with, and an identity that was there to match, basically. And then also the military stuff, like when we're looking at time in the bunker and stuff like that, or like the core split event, like I talked about, is just literal unemotional, like very bare bones practical, like uh all concrete walls, very simplistic, like no real, very jail like, no real um, you know, a lot some training scenarios, just had so much, props essentially. And this kind of thing is pretty much like bare bones, just like a jail would be essentially, and you have rooms that are dedicated to different forms of um, electronic type torture, different physical torture that you can do, things with water and like chemicals, all this kind of stuff, and especially with both of them, there would a lot of times be, drugs used basically of varying types to also help like create this belief in certain feelings, whether that's like overwhelming fear, whether it's heightening suggestibility with like a hallucinogen, essentially, like especially with like the dog training, or when you're dealing with the trauma bonding stuff, really starting to amp up the pleasure causing types of things that relax you, things that make you feel, you know, happy and not scared anymore or not in pain physically anymore. These kinds of things a lot of times are used also. So it's really going to be, Svali talked a lot about her experience with like the Jesuit programming, so it's like she had a part of her that was a star, and they, had like a literal set where you're going through the clouds and going up to visit the other stars and everyone's dressed like stars, so that as a small child, it's like very believable. My unicorn programming, almost identical. The bunker had a huge, outdoor scene kind of thing. This is underground, but it was a massive outdoor scene kind of area with foliage and little islands and brooks and stuff like that. And that area was both used for my unicorn programming with the help of some LSD again, or something along those lines, where it's like there was things set up to make me feel like I actually, this part of me actually was a unicorn, like 100% identified with like I am not a human, I'm a unicorn. It sounds batshit, I know, but it's also like part of like what made me always know that like my thinking and stuff was weird like my whole life, because it's like this is parts of things that we bleed through, is like this is an insane thought to have like until you deal with the memory and you realize like, oh, like, I was traumatized, I was drugged, I was looking into a creek to see my reflection as my dad directed me, and there was a picture, like a literal picture of a unicorn there, which you just like, oh my God, that's my reflection. It's like, it sounds absurd, but it's like, this is like, part of a programming scenario, and then, chased by goblins, there's just so much that, which is obviously people in masks and stuff like that, but you're on a hallucinogen and you're a small kid and you feel like, they might have just killed your dad and now you're running through this fake fucking forest, basically, and then getting captured by like a dark sorcerer who they essentially are imprinting, for that one. I think I've mentioned it before, it's like it was this whole ritual then where uh, I was a unicorn and he stole my horn and now he had power over me. And then forevermore, in my system and in my life, I was convinced that my dad, had this power over me and could read my mind and just like all this different stuff. And it was all because of like this very specific event that was created to like really solidify all these thoughts they wanted me to have, and to know that I would have, this handler, these parts, etc. So they go through a lot of lengths basically, like to, they're completely aware that when the trauma part is formed, like everything they're seeing and experiencing is going to factor into the parts that they're getting out of it, and the likelihood that those parts are really going to internalize the identity they want from, and the roles they want from, the skills they want from, all that kind of stuff, you know.
Now, one thing that comes up a lot that I get questions on that I thought I would ask you is programming scripts and how those fit in and what they are exactly and how they're utilized against somebody.
Yeah, so that pretty much kind of piggybacks on what I just talked about with the unicorn example, for example, or Svali's star example, that it's kind of like why movies and books have always been so popular. It's like where we naturally gravitate towards narratives as human beings, you know, it's like it helps us make sense of um, transformations and story arc, and you know, good versus bad, and who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist, all this kind of stuff. So the point of a script, a programming script, is like something that's been chosen by the handler to essentially create the framework of the parts, like, and you, because you are giving them the script to base it off of, then you know when they take on that identity, all their internal motivations and like what their likes and dislikes are, or ways to motivate, ways to manipulate them, or like what kinds of attachment to dangle in front of them, basically. What has been ubiquitous in a lot of programming, like prior to my time, and there's still remnants, I think, now, you know, because they're psychopaths, and if something works, they continue to use it. But was much more in like an older generation, was stuff that was completely based off of Alice in Wonderland or Wizard of Oz, for example. So with this thing, it's like essentially you would have, like, if we're looking at Wizard of Oz programming, like what you would have essentially is parts in those survivors that went through that identified with Dorothy, you know, which would be kind of more of like a core part, or a front part that was like a normal personality. You know, you're going to have parts like, you know, Tin Man or the Cowardly Lion, or different things to essentially like personify different urges, you know, different aspects of the survivor, and then be like triggerable, you know, into, you know, having certain identities. And you're going to have all kinds of things in their system that are mirroring, you know, what you see on screen. So like internally, basically, like they'll have an emerald city, they'll have a yellow brick road, they'll have they'll have, you know, like the witch's castle, essentially, and the witch, you know, to be there, to be like the persecutor altars in the system, the ones that are like the enforcers, that are very identify with feeling evil and being evil, you know, and have gotten to that point, Stockholm syndrome style, of being like, okay, like I am the wicked witch, and I am anti Dorothy. Even though these are two parts of the same mind, you know, you can have that antagonistic relationship that they want to enforce programming, because they've shown it to a kid, you know, who's highly suggestible and gone through trauma and maybe some drugging, you know, and basically been like, you know, this is you, this is your life, you know, like you don't have to imagine it, you just have to take it in and imprint, you know, these things on the parts of your system, you know, or more programming stuff, you know, like flying monkeys, like, so like little minions that have, I had really similar stuff, but it didn't have the same names. You know, it was like a lot of my stuff was very, like I said, very fantasy-esque, very medieval. A lot of it was reinforced with like early animated Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, you know, and Last Unicorn, different things like this that basically were like, it's, you know, you have a dark sorcerer, you have their minions, which are typically, you know, like goblins or orc type things. Basically, you have in your system the place to house that internally, like a dark tower in like a black land, you know. So essentially, the script is going to be very particular to usually what the handler likes working with, essentially, and it'll have different characteristics or like different names, different like specific identities, but like they all follow the exact same like roles in like a narrative story, like we can understand. Um, so, bad guy, their minions, good guy, their allies, essentially being locked in this internal struggle, where they're working against each other. A lot of times the good guys in the story like know less than the bad guys in the story, and are more like, going through a situation naturally, whereas like the bad guys are the ones with the schemes, the machinations, all the stuff behind the scenes that are propelling the story forward, and that's very much the same with the survivors internal world, is that you're going to have the the quote unquote good parts, the parts that are closer to the survivor's actual identity, to the core, and are going to be the ones that look more normal, just dealing with day-to-day life, essentially. And they're going to know way less than what subconsciously is going to be happening in the cult allied system, which is there to enforce all the programming and the structure that the handlers wanted, as well as keeping tabs on the survivor, punishing them if they're not following the behaviors and thoughts that they're supposed to be according to their abuser. So it runs the gamut, like mine was very medieval. Like I said, there's Alice in Wonderland stuff, there's Wizard of Oz stuff, there's more technology based things, especially like sci-fi type things like Star Trek or different stuff like that, where same thing, different color. In that case, you might have like, instead of you know, castle and that kind of stuff, you might have a spaceship or a home planet, and then satellite planets or different things like that, different races, all this kind of stuff to essentially solidify. You can almost hold any work of fiction up, side by side, and see that there's these commonalities between them, and that's kind of the point of the programming script, is creating that predictable path, those predictable alters. And on a certain level, it's what the handlers like, and they themselves identify with typically, so it's what is going to be easy for them to remember, and them to, on a certain level get off on, that they're, having this much control over another person, and on a certain level fulfilling their own fantasies.
Are scripts read? For example, obviously there's these scenarios where adults probably have an idea of crafting a narrative that they're either one person or multiple are speaking to you that's pre-planned, and they have a goal to get you to have a specific outcome mentally at the end and emotionally of gathering that information and what they expect the end result to be. Are there also scripts read where maybe you're sleeping or in a different type of brainwave? Or are these all kind of like active where you're in one of these scenarios and having things sort of reenacted to you visually and, audibly and sensually?
So, from my experience, the most powerful ones were always was always something that you were physically in, like a LARPing type situation. So, those were the ones that were the most powerful. Second most powerful would be just being shown a video, essentially, like of snuff pornography on up to like just like a Hollywood movie. But in my experience, like if it's a movie, it's going to be edited in a way to reinforce like their narrative too. They're not going to show you the whole thing to the end where the good guy wins, because that's like not the point of what they're doing. It's just, but they're trying to make sure. So in my experience, I don't have any memory of it ever being just read to me, but I really have a hunch that this is because like they don't want, many people get disappointed when they see a movie of a book that they've been very fond of, because their imagination came into play to like, this is the way this character looked, this is the way this character looked, this is what that land or that house or castle, whatever it was, in the thing that they were reading, it's like they generated in their own mind a very specific image, essentially. And then it's like you're excited for the movie, but then you see it and it's like different than what you pictured. And you might be disappointed. You might be excited too, because it might be better than you could have imagined. It also, you might be disappointed because you were attached to like these characters looking a certain way, etc. Um, and in my experience, like also like once you've seen the movie, it's hard to go back to what you actually had initially imagined. Like now, going back and reading that book again, are you going to still see the version that you imagined when you first read the book, or are you now, in my experience, not going to be able to forget the version that you then saw on screen? So to me, it's and this is just my hunch, that it's like a psychological thing, that it's like if the programming is all about control, that really like reading stuff on a certain level would be helpful for imprinting certain um, negative self-talk, internalized beliefs, or stuff like that, things that they purposely want certain parts to be saying to the survivor in the system, or things that they want them to perform saying, during a triggered event, with a switch where they're just like, this is what you're supposed to say, how you're supposed to act. In those scenarios, I think for sure things can be read. But when it comes to scripts specifically, my hunch is they don't use them a ton, just because it's like I said, like they want to know exactly what the things look like, but also because if you're entrained to something visual, especially media style, you can re-trigger them just by showing them the same movie essentially, and that was part of what was ubiquitous in my house. Is like my dad had no interest in like fantasy type shit, but it's like we had a huge unicorn collection all over the house, and then eventually was migrated just to my bedroom, something that they started before I was even born. Essentially, my dad suddenly started getting, so this is part of how they do know, at least for me, what my plan was, essentially, because that was central to my programming, was the whole unicorn thing. And before I was born, my dad was already friends, just kept giving, my mom was always like totally confused by it. And she was like, all of our friends, which means all of my dad's friends, Frank's friends, all of them kept giving, like, they just kept giving us unicorns, She's like, we brought back some unicorns from Germany, and then people, like, everyone was giving us unicorns all the time. So by the time I'm born, there are, you know, unicorn goblets and unicorn bells and fucking brass unicorns, like all these unicorns around, so you're already kind of like familiarizing the victim with certain imagery. And then, like I said, the Lord of the Rings, or different, or Last Unicorn, different stuff like that. It's like being, one of the few, we had cable, but it was like one of the few VHS we had in the house was this kind of stuff, which reinforced, all the stuff that they had done during programming stuff. You just have to watch it again, and it really re-triggers like identifying certain things, and it really, like, for those parts, it's like they see it again, and it brings up, all those same memories and reinforces it basically.
Thank you for that. It's good to just have some of these questions out in the open. It's just not talked about a lot, so I really appreciate you sort of breaking some of the stuff down that's left out of some of these conversations, just because it might not be uh, part of somebody's story that they feel is relevant to share. And I think some people too might not remember these parts of their stories too. So I really appreciate you breaking this down, and as usual, having really palatable ways to understand this. And since we're talking about sort of parts and systems, I want to also interweave and continue the conversation of building on the types of programming that they do to create these parts. But since we're talking about parts, I want to start interweaving that conversation in here and sort of talk about this hierarchy of the designs of these systems and the parts that they put in them. So whenever you're young and you have, for example, that core split event, which is a lot of times kind of that first event, um, depending on the child, of course, or where and how they're raised and in what cult group. But in your experience, that very young core split event was a huge a huge event for you and, for this early development and this training that you continue to get pushed throughout your childhood and, young adult years. And so whenever they first start these fracturing processes and inflicting this trauma, does that hierarchy start there? Do they know exactly what parts that right away that they want to start creating? Or how does that process start as far as the strategy behind creating a system and parts for an individual at that young age?
Yeah, so definitely. Like it's going to be a huge part of why they're doing what they're doing. Essentially, any parts that are Stockholm syndrome or cult allied are going to be the ones that are the um, top of the hierarchy for the system. And this means that essentially, like the ones that are ultimately like keeping the structure of the system intact in the way that the abusers wanted, and really kind of always monitoring things from behind the scenes, essentially. So they're the ones pulling all the strings of the survivor behind the scenes, making them respond to certain triggers and doing all these things, maintaining relationships with abusers, um, trying to distract themselves from healing, or move away from healing, or just like going through a lot of denial programming, for example, of just, memories come up and you just are used to just saying, I'm crazy, I'm crazy, I'm crazy. That's a program, that you have inside of your system. But all of this is orchestrated in the survivor long term by the cult allied parts. So those are going to be the top of the hierarchy, the ones that have the ultimate say. Until the survivor really starts healing, they're going to be the ones that have the ultimate say on like where your life is directed, where your thoughts are directed, are going to fight the most against healing and trying to like reveal them and process all of the memories that you went through. They only want you to access those memories if they're trying to pull up body memories or overwhelming feelings, to essentially intimidate you away from healing or into self-destructive behavior or discrediting type behavior. Essentially, like it's always going to come from the top of the hierarchy, which is the cult allied parts. So the cult allied parts are typically going to be the parts that are part of the loyalty training and the trauma bonding side of things. So they know early on, and maybe this would actually be a good time to pull up the image that I brought with like the circle.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sorry for people that are listening only. I will try my hardest to just, be able to explain this. Um, so basically, this little drawing that I made, this little graph, I don't know what to call it, infographic. I don't know what the heck to call it. But regardless, it's basically like a little chart that shows essentially during a trauma event that there are certain stages that the person is going to go through, the child is going to go through. And like the order in which they progress, so we would start at the bottom, which is normalcy. So that's like the child in their, the part that deals with their day-to-day life, is there probably out most of the time, is going to be the part of you that's going to school and dealing with your parents when they're not acting abusive. And basically, it's going to be most of your life, essentially. It's going to be normalcy. And then you're going to shift from that part of yourself, that consciousness, as soon as like a trauma event is starting to happen and it becomes more and more entrained, the more it's repeated, and then the older the person gets, so it's like it'll take less and less to really like trigger you by the abuser into this next part. A lot of times it will just be you reading body language on the abuser and being like, okay, like now my dad's drunk and the likelihood that he's got that look in his eye and he's probably going to molest me, like that kind of thing. It's like you're going to, at that fear is like the next step on this 4-part cycle, that fear is going to trigger you to switch into the part that's used to dealing with whatever specific trauma you're facing, essentially. Um, those parts are always going to be, where you get your emotional flashbacks from. It's going to be the parts of you that a lot of times motivate a lot of all of the other, it's the initial trauma reaction. That's going to be a lot of times what motivates the other parts that are branched off of it. But it's also going to be a part that's often dissociated from the parts that branch off of it because um, you uh, you'll just have like usually your very emotional or pain holding physical or emotional parts. You'll just have them basically like walled off essentially before it you trigger into so that fear part is walled off from the normalcy part because you're initiating a trauma event and like this bubble of dissociation that's going to separate this from your normal consciousness. And then on the other side of that is you're going to be switching into the next step on this part, which is the solution part of you. So this is going to be the part that, okay, is like, I am facing this trauma right now. Now I'm maybe going through emotional pain and physical pain and stuff. And now what do I do about it, basically? So it's going to be like the solution, the survival part of your dealing, your dissociation, you're dealing with this trauma event. And the solution part is usually going to be characterized by what we had mentioned before, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, this kind of stuff, to where you're faced with this trauma, you're faced with this life threatening or painful event. Like, now what are you going to do about it? Are you going to have become a part that can completely dissociate pain and like just completely wall it off, and separate your consciousness from your body's experience? Are you going to become a part that realizes like, okay, this is a trafficking event and I can avoid most injury if I play along with what's going on? You play the child prostitute essentially of being like, a willing participant in what is going on, because that part that's been trained for pornography or for trafficking has been shown that you can, through many instances, that you can lessen the amount of pain you're going to go through if you just cooperate and act willing in the situation. So that would be the fawn response. You can have, like we said, there's like fight and flight, which typically are not used in the survivor until a little bit later in programming. And by later, I mean like, like 7 or 8, 6 or 7 or 8, as opposed to like 3 or 4, essentially. But those parts where all you wanted to do in the situation was fight, to attack your abusers, but you were too tiny and, had no ability to do so. You're easily overpowered, or just run away from a situation. You have a lot of like parts that are there to be have that anger weaponized into violence directed at whoever the abusers want. And you also have a lot of parts that have the urge to run, essentially. So like literally, to like, in my experience, the parts of me that were created to try and like run away from healing, for example, or from a place that actually was safe, it would be this like overwhelming feeling that I just needed to run back to the cult or back to my handlers, and that would alleviate the internal turmoil, that I was going through that was triggered. So it would be return home parts, for example, would be like this flight mechanism, uh, basically weaponized against the survivor. So yeah, so you have normalcy part, the fear part, and then slash pain, and then the solution part or survival part that's going to be like, okay, this is how I have to perform in this instance to minimize damage to my psyche and my body, essentially. And then the last part of this, which is, long-winded, but getting back to the hierarchy question, is the loyalty part. So the whole point of all of this trauma programming is that they're trying to trauma bond you and, create these parts and this system in you. And it's predicated, all of this is built on the fact that you have some loyalty, love, or attachment to your abusers. So, and they're completely aware of this. This is like a Nazi base, for decades, and then mystery religions before that. It's like this has been something that has been studied and codified, turned into a system for, you know, hundreds of years at this point, maybe thousands. I don't know how long it goes back. But regardless, it's like that you have to put the person through trauma, even just basic military training. You put the person through trauma, and then you give them afterwards the reward of praise, of a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, love, a lot of love bombing type stuff, like that you're essentially taking this child that's just been traumatized, and you don't just like leave them there. Essentially, you follow it up with like creating a savior in their life, or reinforcing like this idea, especially with like the covens. People, it was very much like this. Gates himself was very much like this. It's like you would complete some training, you would complete some trauma event, and like they're giving you tons of praise and just like, sometimes rewards. You could be dealing with, being pampered, like I was given massages or treated, also in the same area where I had the unicorn programming in the bunker, having like a Greco-Roman gazebo where I'm being given like a goddess type experience, where it's like I'm being worshipped, and this occult part basically to really identify with being like a deity and worshipped, and like in this very idyllic area. You can be given comfort objects like stuffed animals, certain foods, especially sweets or stuff like that. There's going to be a point during this trauma cycle where they're going to intentionally, bond you with, sometimes there'll be even that abuser being put in a scenario where the abuser seems like they're saving your life or something. So the part essentially feels like, okay, like this person means protection. This person means safety. This person means, being treated really well, essentially. That most of the time, the parts that come out of this sector, where they have an identity that is completely allied with the cult and the cult's belief system and your place in whatever hierarchy they have shown to you, as far as like how to get power, how to be safe and not be one of the people that are being sacrificed, for example. These parts essentially, they have a completely different reality, obviously, than the solution based parts, the fear based parts, or your normal child parts. But these are the parts that are in my experience always at the top of the hierarchy, because they feel invested in seeing, everything that they went through, like just so not having real experience, a real connection to the emotional and physical pain. What they have a connection to is all of the quote unquote good things that you've shown come from being allied with the cult. So because of that, you're going to have, early on experiences like this that are very much, giving parts the reins very early on to the system, to being like, okay, these parts, they can use the fear parts or the solution, like weaponized against the survivor. They can use the solution parts to perform certain tasks. But ultimately, they're the ones that are like, the king of the castle, the one that gets to direct the whole orchestra of the survivors' system, like reinforcing the layout of their kingdom, essentially, and then controlling the actions of like all the people they see as below them. So, in my experience, like each of these parts would have more access to knowing like the big picture, essentially. So like the fear part, the normalcy parts have like the least knowledge, essentially, of everything that's going on behind the scenes in the subconscious. Like the fear parts have more of an idea, Solution parts have been given even more like leeway in the system, because they're the ones that are completely encoded to have a purpose and a role and functions in the system. And they completely identify with that, with just pure purpose. And then you're going to have above that the loyalty ones, which can essentially, like, like top of a tower, you're surveying the whole, everything that's going on beneath them, essentially. So it's like a almost like an intelligence type of situation where it's like need to know basis, and the ones at the top are the ones that have access to knowledge of everything. And eventually that's kind of how healing works for a survivor. In my experience is that you are going to follow this same progression in dealing with the parts. Essentially, you're going to initially be dealing with the fear-based incest parts, and then you're going to move on to starting to deal with the parts that are less, have more identity dysphoria, or less identified with your actual identity, and more identified with these different, very um, fantastical, very different, like men, animals, all these things that are not your actual identity, but they are very identified with, and it creates a lot of splits in the survivor system and how these parts can, work against each other, and we work against ourselves because of it.
In regards to the strategy of obviously events are planned, they have a specific outcome that they want with these different trauma events. Is there also a hierarchy in how they create parts? For example, the loyalty parts, are those typically kind or like the occult loyal, the occult active ones, the ones that are overseeing the system, the ones up at the top of your internal hierarchy, are those ones typically created first? Or what is the strategy for how they actually pick out which part they want to create, um, as far as in regards to the trauma events?
So I think they're not initially created, because in my experience, like, you have to have a certain amount of trauma that the kid has gone through, either through incest or some initial organized stuff. You have to have enough of that gone on so that when you present them with this alternate reality, that they're very willing to take it on. That's part of dissociation, is convincing yourself this isn't happening to me, this didn't happen to me. So it's like once you've gone through a decent amount of initial trauma, then they're going to introduce, the next step, which is basically like, okay, like, but you could be this instead, and it's not natural and normal for that person, that child, to essentially to uh to latch on to that. It's like they when you have so much dark, it's like when you see a little speck of what seems like light, you're gonna run towards it, like full steam. And that's 100% what's going on here. Is like, so I mean, you have up right now the graph of like emotional intensity, and it's like if you were to look at the central line, that would just be a normal, like no emotion, you're just like resting state, you're not super happy, you're not super sad. Below it would be like the worst you could feel, more depressed, more angry, more abandoned, full of fear. And then above it would be all of the positive emotions, positive side of the spectrum, the feeling of love, of bonding, of belonging, of just, enjoying literal, just like physical pleasures and stuff like that as well. And that's what you see is here is like the dip down, all the way down to like, the most, you know heart stopping terrified that you could be, like, right, feeling like you're about to get killed or something like that. um all the way down at the bottom and completely abandoned, and like, like you're a child left alone in the woods or something, that level of like being terrified, essentially, or literally experiencing a lot of physical torture in those situations sometimes. um, and you're going to have essentially like this dip down into that, and then as you come back up into your solution part, that's going to be back to dissociating the feelings, the emotions, all of that kind of stuff. um, and then you'll be able to have the complete high afterwards when you're dealing with like the loyalty and love portion of the trauma event. So the if when a child has gone through this much, given the option of where they would want to be on this graph, I mean, anyone would want to be at that high point, feeling the loyalty and love and good stuff, but you're especially going to cling to it if you've gone through so much um, bad stuff, essentially, you've really experienced how bad it can get. So that in my experience is initially why they're going to create a lot of trauma, essentially, so that once they do present this, like I said, this alternate reality of being able to be part of some hierarchy, special, chosen, all of that stuff, that it feels like the antithesis of the worst things you've already experienced. It's going to really solidify for those parts, like, okay, like this is a hierarchy part. They're only going to be able to see the benefits of being involved with these people, not any of the and they're going to be able to just want to stay in that place and want to stay blocking out essentially all of the bad stuff that's a lot of healing, is getting the cult allied parts to recognize that the little girl that was, raped and tortured was them, because that's what a lot of their loyalty is predicated on, is seeing that part of themselves as literally a different person, like someone else that went through those kinds of things. And when you realize, like, oh, like um, I've been doing this thinking that I'm protecting the body and our mind from certain things, but really, like, all these things didn't happen to someone else; they did happen to me. So it's like it's a very big step in healing when you can start getting those parts to recognize, like, okay, I'm still allied to my dad, I'm still allied to Gates, I'm still allied to this uh, coven, this occult coven type of thing, like this feeling of of being rewarded and belonging and all this stuff. And now I have to realize those same people are the ones that did all the things that they promised this part of me they would never do, and you realize all the humiliation, all that kind of stuff. It goes a long way in the deprogramming process. We can really start working on these hierarchy parts, because it's a lot of what has been keeping most of the amnesia and the making you accessible, all of this stuff intact, is really their ability to still be convinced that their abusers are allies on a certain level.
Now, as far as the system aspect goes, obviously the parts have different systems that they belong to. How do they essentially choose which parts get paired together? Obviously, on your chart, you can see that there's kind of like the loyalty, normalcy, but how do they kind of decide, or excuse me, loyalty, fear, solution, to sort of dumb it down a little bit to keep it simple? How do they decide, like, which ones go into specific spaces together within you? And why is a system so important? Why do they need that for these parts inside?
So, I mean, they needed to really reinforce um, the structure that they want. It's like they're not going to be, around the survivor for most of their lives. If there's someone like me that was like trained to do stuff into adulthood, like, that's just not going to happen. For a small child, you are around them a lot of times, but you're not around them at school. So there's, well, you might have handlers around, but regardless, it the whole point of this is to create, a mental trap where it's like you're both the prisoners and the prison guards, so that's going to be a huge part of it, is knowing that you have these different kinds of parts that are willing and identified with these roles, essentially. Um, so in my experience, like, it parts are generally grouped together. So you would have like an area in the system that has all of, or maybe even a couple areas in the system that have all of the uh, cult allied parts, basically. In part because it's like these are the parts that are going to be, sharing each other's experience and kind of reinforcing it. um, the going back to like the setting, externally that you see, but then you internalize, that's going to be where they're comfortable, what they identify as their home. If you're dealing with like an evil part, uh, the only thing that's going to feel comfortable to them internally is going to be, like an evil dark black castle. You know what I mean? With all the gothy shit that you've been told, is your jam, basically. Like, so all the parts that have that identity are gonna want to be there. You're dealing with like child, like apparently normal parts. You're gonna have a place that is way less intense. Like a place that is more what a normal kid would like. Something maybe, outside or comforting. Like a garden or um a someone kind in your life's like house, different things like this are experiences of myself and other survivors. It's going to be whatever is like comfortable to like your quote unquote like normal parts, essentially. And in my experience, like you're going to have a level of like almost like burying these different lands, these different worlds, beneath each other, depending on where it is they want them, like how far it is they want them to be from your normal consciousness, basically. So for me, it's like my military programming was very close to my normal consciousness, in part because my front had a military trained part, like a soldier part that was there to be like a gatekeeper and like overseer of like what was going on with like my normal parts in day-to-day life. But it was very, minimal, essentially. Because it's like you don't want to have, in a survivor like this, you don't want to have it to be that noticeable that they're dealing with control, other thinking, of their abusers and stuff. um and then buried more is going to be the occult parts, where I mean the solution parts, so the parts that have like jobs, essentially skills, still things you don't want to leak into the consciousness as someone to suddenly have skills that they shouldn't have or knowledge they shouldn't have. But it is going to be closer to it's less dangerous, that information, if like the survivor outsiders were to come across it. It's less dangerous to the abusers and them getting found out. And then you're going to have stuff like, assassination type stuff with some people, with like military stuff, or the occult type stuff, the really, really like secretive stuff, they're going to have that buried even more. And like we said, those are still the parts that, in my experience, like those areas get more and more numerous, essentially, because it's like it's the areas where you really want to make sure there isn't bleed through for the consciousness. So you're going to have, the vast amount of trauma memories stored in this lowest area, basically, which if you were looking at the hierarchy would be at the highest area. But when it comes to how close it is to the conscious day-to-day reality, it's like the most buried, essentially, in the subconscious. And that's where you're going to have both the hierarchy parts, but then also all of it's like they're going to be there to manage all of the trauma holding parts, the ones that have a lot of, trying to minimize the PTSD symptoms, essentially, because they're going to be the parts that hold all of the, remembrance of like the pain and torture, betrayal you went through. So a lot of survivors in systems have things like, pits, dungeons, different things where it's basically like a dumping ground that, is like a prison, essentially, for all of these things they don't want to, all these trauma memories they don't want to bleed through. And the people that you have as the jailers are the hierarchy parts that, essentially see themselves, like I said, like in my case, like an evil king or an evil queen type of thing, where you're like, these are the dissidents, these are the people that have to be in the dungeon being tortured, you know what I mean? And it's very matter of fact. It's just a way of like of running a kingdom and enforcing rules and stuff like that. It's not seen as some crazy internal narrative that you're doing to like work against yourself. It's like those parts are so dissociated from your identity. They really do feel like, and like I said, and notice on like the graph, it's like they're the furthest away from like your normal actual identity, basically. So it's the easiest for them to be like, have gone through so much and, dealt with so much like repetitive scenarios of trauma programming that they are just cannot identify at all with like your day to day identity, your front identity where you're a kid going to school and, maybe excelling at school and having talents and stuff like that. And then it's like you can't even, and or in my case too, it's like that front part of me was programmed to be insanely like shy and just like soft spoken and stuff. So it's like, and not have any self esteem, for example. So, and the parts that were in the hierarchy felt the opposite. They felt, that entitlement and that narcissism, that the abusers wanted us to have, where we were like, we are the best and the strongest and like the most talented and the most chosen and all these different abilities or whatever that we have and should be proud of the basically. And then you look at this like weak individual, this small child that's like going through their middle school or something like that, and it's like, and they can't even, they're like, that's so not me. And why would I ever want to be that, basically. Simultaneously, you have in the survivor, as they're trying to heal this kind of abuse and really just process the crap that you went through, when you're dealing with these antagonistic parts basically in your system and in your mind, it's like they don't want to be seen. And on a certain level, you don't want to see them because you don't want to really, it's one thing to recognize that you're a victim of incest and then a victim of trafficking. But when you realize that you were forced into perpetration and stuff like that, on a certain level, that's so antithetical to the way you want to see yourself, is you don't want to see yourself as like the crazy psychopath ruler narcissist, like it's like, I don't care how hot they thought they were, or how like or how like you know uh talented at crimes they were, or how like all this different stuff that this part was entrained. It's like you would be like, nothing would be worth having to inflict harm on another individual. So it's like that's a lot of it too, is like during healing, it's like, okay, now I have to wrap my head around the fact that I was forced into it through a lot of trauma early on, but like you know ultimately, like, it was still something that this physical body did do, even if I wasn't completely conscious for, in my normal right mind, for all of those actions that I was programmed and trained to do, and a lot of that is just so much, I think the episode is called Core Split Event, where I talked about right after I'd moved to Texas, and there was all this initial programming. It's like, it was like kind of like the main shock and awe event. It's like the complete core split was, that first association was incest with my father. But it's like for them to create all these parts that were supremely motivated by how bad it could really get. It was a complete shock and awe event where, it was, days essentially spent in bunker type scenario and being put through all of like the most unimaginable, traumas, like being kept in a room with a corpse, being raped repeatedly, being, convinced by Jesus, when I told him about the rape and he enters the room, telling me I'm a liar. And then from that part, you get um, your denial programming. So it's like you have your initial, it's like from that one event, it was kind of like the kennel where it was split up to create specific traumas that were so powerful and so intense and so early in your life that you knew what little things you could show that kid, or what scenario you could put that kid in to bring all that very intense fear and emotion and physical pain up, essentially. And then you just have to put that child through something that's reminiscent of, you know, the kid burning alive, the kid being torn up by dogs, you bring up things that are reminiscent of this thing that the kid you already know went through, and then you know that you're accessing that part essentially, and that part now has switched into the consciousness because it's been triggered to remember that initial trauma, and now you can build upon it. You know, you can further it with more trauma, but then also you're going to have that version of you, that identity of you, that you can also then reward and create a different part that's identified with what they want, you know. So for example, like the dog thing, like I just mentioned, that it's like you have seen a child torn apart by a dog. So then when they are doing your dog programming, essentially it's like, and they're trying to convince you to kill a kitten, they can threaten you with like being torn apart by a dog. And they know both A, that it's like this is the initial trauma that you're going to be bringing up in this scenario. And then you have the setting of like the kennel and stuff, so you know you're tapping into like the dog part that they've created, but then you can essentially convince a child that doesn't want to kill a kitten to kill a kitten because they're so terrified that they're literally going to get torn apart by a dog because that's what's been threatened, and they've actually seen it happen, so they know how horrible it can be, you know. So this is how you have the initial trauma, so you just build on them, like after it's like you access the same part, and then you can amp up the trauma, amp up like the intensity of the event, you know, and you're going to get a new part that's, you know, kind of being, you know, stepped down this path, you know, to having the internal beliefs they want and then the beliefs of identity that they want. Um, Sorry, I don't know if I like lost the plot on that question, but
No, no,
yeah.
that was really thorough. Thanks for answering that. And as far as like sort of digging into what you were talking about with remembering and having sort of this memory integration come to be co-conscious between these parts, in your experience, was there a layering of that as well? Were there certain parts that came forth first in that hierarchy to share with you their memories and to start integrating their memories with you? Or was that sort of random where you had different parts from different aspects of the hierarchy all coming together and spitting out memories to you?
So I would say both,
Yeah.
which is like, so initial, like when I was initially doing the work around the incest, I it's like a fish in the water type of thing. So I always had like three voices that I was dealing with for the most part, that I was completely conscious of pretty much my whole life essentially. But it's like fish in the water thing. It's because it's what you all always have essentially. It's like you don't
So
like
normal.
see it. It's normal. You don't see it as like weird or different, you know. Um, so it's like I could recognize, you know, at that point I was having like flashbacks and nightmares and stuff, you know, and dealing with like physical and emotional flashbacks that I had no context for and everything. So on a certain level I was meeting parts from like those deeper layers. But at that point you don't have any context for it as a survivor other than knowing your PTSD symptoms and knowing your triggers, which don't make any sense to you, you know. Different, a lot of stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But you know, my initial taking of like the DES, the dissociative experiences scale, was a lot of like where it was very much brought to my attention, because it was like I had the experience of the part of me that wanting to heal. You know, my main normal part was trying to answer the questions on the questionnaire accurately. And then I had the part of me that, you know, was like the military trained gatekeeper part, like a male who essentially was um, repeating all the like verbal script types things that they wanted us to say to ourselves, which is, you're being like, this isn't your actual experience, you're being dramatic, you're being crazy, you're just like all this different stuff. So it's like it would ask something simple like whether you had amnesia of childhood or different, you know, points of amnesia throughout like your life and different stuff like that. And it would be, you know, wanting to answer on the thing and then having this like, you know, argument essentially going on in my head as far as like how to answer. and everything. And then realizing, sharing it with my therapist, being like, yeah, you score pretty high on like the dissociative experiences scale, which he had figured because I was already talking about um, my memories of being molested by my father, and that being a lot of why I was dealing with depression and suicidality and that kind of stuff. But essentially, being like, that's not most people's experience when they, are trying to like answer a quiz or something. Like they're not typically like having multiple voices that are arguing with like how you should move your hand, basically. So, um, and what I would say is that, it's going to take, so you're going to deal with parts of all parts of the system coming up whenever you are dealing with certain triggers in your life. And this could be either intentionally created triggers or just scenarios that are very similar to what created those parts initially. A lot of times it won't have a lot of context, though, for a survivor that's early on in healing because they don't actually have access to the memories yet that are creating that essentially. So it'll just feel like you're behaving completely irrationally or thinking completely irrationally because you don't understand that there's a part of you that for them it's completely rational what they're feeling. So it's like before I had really dealt with like most of my kennel programming and like the dog programming and stuff. It was like being involved in dog fights where my dogs were getting in fights, would bring up these parts, that were essentially kind of psychopathic and violent and like what my dog parts, my wolf parts had been trained to be. And just, my normal self experiencing it and just being like, where the fuck does this come? Where does this come from? And usually, and you're gonna deal because you don't have a lot of context for stuff, you're gonna just deal with it and be like, I'm, what you're typically supposed to repeat in your head to them is I'm crazy, I'm just like, who the heck knows where this stuff is coming from? Like why is it that I would want to react in this situation with like, my front part just wants to break up the dog fight. My wolf part wants to go inside and grab a knife and just end this shit real quick. Like, and that's like, it doesn't, it's like, and you're just looking at yourself like, well, like, how could I even have these thoughts? And that's like being early in healing and encountering parts that like you don't understand their identity, you don't understand their emotions yet, or why it is they want to react this way, but you're just sharing the experience because of a trigger, essentially. Um, so, what was I going to say? And then the other thing I would say is like, yeah, that, so context is a big part of it. Most survivors, in my experience, work through the incest first, which is fucked up to say that it's like the least traumatic of the things that they went through. But most of the time, it's like you're going to deal with that for two reasons. Like, one, because it is going to be, the context that you're going to need for the rest of your story. Like it's going to be usually the part of your core being split, but then also it's like, like finally acknowledging that your dad has been your handler and trafficker is going to be the first step in being able to deal with you have context for all these other memories and all these other parts. Um, but it's also that deeper parts are going to be more reluctant to heal. And when they see it role modeled through other parts being able to heal, they're going to be more and more likely to just naturally share their stuff and trust that there's going to be a path to healing at all, really. But that was a lot of what my experience was too, is like that initially in like very early on in therapy, like the first few months of really getting into dealing with like the incest, like when I came out of the hospital, like all of this stuff, like it was like very early on in healing to being like, okay, I'm finally talking to a therapist about all the crap that I went through and trying to create like piece together how to process this and deal with my emotions around it and verbalize my emotions and all this kind of stuff that like I had a lot of a lot of flashes of things that I wouldn't deal with for years in therapy, and at the time had no context to me. It's like I would tell my therapist, I was like, I feel like I was a high priced prostitute. I feel like I was gang raped. I feel, like all this stuff. And I'm just like, but I just must be crazy. You know what I mean? Like I have all these like symptoms that we talk about, and I had a good therapist to the point where like he wasn't ever going to suggest anything. Well, maybe you went through this or maybe you went through that. But it's like I would be coming to him with like where like where could this stuff come from really, and it would be something that I would table, because it's like you recognize that you're not ready to deal with this information yet, so it would be like this thing I would bring up and then would, the system would redissociate to a degree and be like, okay, not yet, we're not going to be dealing with that stuff yet because like we're like not mentally capable of like when you don't remember most of your life and you start getting these memories back and they're as horrible as they are, it's like it takes time to process everyone. It's a lengthy process, and but it does get easier and faster in my experience the more you set this template for healing in your system. So um
Thank you for answering that. You've mentioned before on both your podcasts, and it's come up whenever we've talked about dissociation and parts in previous episodes briefly, how at one time you can have potentially up to four parts kind of working together as a team, for example.
mhm.
I've also heard that different parts can have, say, different handwriting. They can write with different hands. They can maybe have different eye prescription, like eyesight prescriptions. Certain, parts might have perfect eyesight. Some might need contacts or glasses. What else, in your experience, would people maybe be surprised to know kind of the differences in individual parts? And then also other things that maybe they can do together once they're aware of each other through the healing process.
I mean, so that's definitely one of the things that's like the greatest, one of the best gifts of healing, is that if you've identified for so long as, so low self-esteem or just like all these things that, the programs have like convinced you can't do, and then to realize that you can do them, like, yeah, that's like a huge part like of healing. Like I would never, until I had healed to a point, I would never have been able to talk on podcasts like this, for example. Like it's just something that, it's like luckily for me and sucks for them that it's like I had a part that was somewhat trained to be, they had me slated for having a hierarchy position like after the NWO takeover. So it was like some diplomacy type stuff and being able to like feel confident and comfortable talking, like to to people and being tactful and stuff like that. Like that's something that was encouraged in me, and then healing that part was a huge part of being able to talk today, or like my main front part, which was there to mask emotions and stuff. And, that's how we get giggly, lighthearted, humorous me essentially, is because I had this front personality, this that it wasn't my main consciousness, but it was one of the three voices that I pretty much always had in my head growing up, that it's like they were there to like be the mask of normalcy, over all of the crazy crap that was going on in my head, all the depression. It's like no one would look at me and realize that I was depressed or that I was struggling or any of these things because I had this part that they had trained to, above all, seem normal and cheerful and not experiencing anger or upset or stuff like that. Um, and then yeah, and then the other part that was like the gatekeeper military type part that was there to like, be the negative self-talk to basically make sure I was always bullied into being uh who I was supposed to be, in both internally and externally in my behaviors. I mean, parts can differ as much as any human being can. It's like physical looks, mental beliefs, systems of morality, like belief systems and religions. Like it really is it's wild, how different it can be expressed. That's a lot of like it's a lot of the kid being what they think they have to be in that situation to survive what seems like the safest, best route to take. And kids' imagination can go freaking wild. But yeah, in my experience, like you're gonna have teams for multiple different reasons, especially when you're dealing with like military or trafficking assignments, or even occult assignments. That pretty much it's like if it was an occult assignment, then there would be one part that was ready, that was there to be the initial trigger to switch into the cult system that I had in my head with all of that belief system, all of that knowledge and everything. The one that was willingly waking up out of bed, walking out of the house to meet, my handlers, and then going to the spot. And then you would initially also have um, team for that occult assignment, parts of you that are, maybe know a certain amount about ceremonies, take on certain identities of like a goddess or royalty type persona, with like a lot of like decorum and you feel like you're hierarchy, but then you respect hierarchy as well, and this idea of like lineage and all this crap. And then you're going to have the parts that needs to be like the ritual horror when you get there, or the butcher. Essentially, it's like these are all. It's going to be like a sequence of parts that the handler is going to be able to trigger so that you can perform each task. But a lot of times it's very compartmentalized. So the part of you that's being a priestess or prostitute part of you is not the same part of you that's, in my experience, like the butcher, which is a part that's very dissociated, that feels like they have almost no identity other than like being a tool, and that's very different than feeling like you're, a personification of the goddess or something like that. And it would be the same event, that you would need these different parts for, but that's where the hierarchy comes in, is like you would have a hierarchy part that would essentially be putting these teams together for the assignment to ensure that you had all the parts, all the tools in your toolbox you needed to go through the different steps that were expected of you and able to perform each of the tasks. If you're looking at like a military type thing, you would still have a part that's willing to respond to a handler and take you into a certain location, basically, but you would have parts that have been trained in certain techniques in violence, for example. You would essentially be tapping into soldier parts and stuff, and would almost have like like a team, a soldier team, where it's like this person is, this person's the medic, and this person's the infantry, and this person's the officer that's calling the shots. Same kind of scenario. So you have all these different, very compartmentalized parts that allow you to have way more knowledge and skills than you should, essentially. And that is like one of the things that I say is really great with healing, is that um, it's very empowering, essentially, when you realize that all of these parts are you, and that a lot of this knowledge, like to a degree, you run into like the issues of like belief is like one of like the core things in being able to perform certain tasks and stuff, like having that confidence. And you do experience some shaking of that confidence for those parts that have those skills when you merge with your normal self, essentially, when you start processing and realizing, okay, like this is my actual identity. On a certain level, you do experience a little bit of like bleed through of like being like, whoa, it's crazy that I have this knowledge. It's crazy that I have like this ability or whatever. Um, but ultimately, what I've experienced is it's way more that you feel like now your main self has, it's like that's part of healing, is kind of integrating you to feeling like you yourself have control over these things essentially. And it can be very empowering because it's part of like what, if you felt like a victim before, you can experience the feeling of having felt like you were in control or dealing with a certain amount of like power, or even just like physical defense type of things, physical and mental defense type of things, where it's like you, rather than feeling like a victim all the time mentally for people that are trying to manipulate you, which a lot of times our front parts are. Now you can easily pick out a manipulator, and you can read people like way, like just better than you've ever, been able to in your front personality, because you have parts that are trained for that and aren't trained to be a victim, are trained to be hierarchy. And the same from a physical standpoint, is like if you are integrating a part, dealing with memories and of your violence training, then you can feel a lot more confident in your body and your ability to handle a threat from a physical perspective, because you've recalled the training to a degree, and like you still have this kind of like locked away in you to where you're not feeling so vulnerable anymore. Um, so in my experience, I haven't had like, a whole lot of like, eyesight change or stuff like that. Definitely different handwriting, different art styles, different speaking and narrative styles, different accents, different all kinds of stuff, but for the most part, it's been more about like the knowledge that we've had, and then also the physical abilities, and that in my experience as a survivor is part of like why journaling is so important and really, dialoguing with yourself, because it's like that's some of the stuff that becomes very validating. It's hard to get validation with any of this kind of crap, um, but when you can show yourself, when you're early on dealing with denial parts, like showing yourself that you have knowledge or skills that you don't ever remember learning, or you don't, it's like it's something that you can't deny, So early on, when you're dealing with denial programming and all that kind of stuff, it's where things are important to be like, okay, like this is something I'm remembering. Let's look it up on the internet. Is this a thing? And yes, it's like those are hunting techniques, those are butchering techniques, those are, different things that early on you're like, because on a certain level, it's like that's part of how denial programming works. Is like on a certain level, that front part, like we talked about, is always going to want to believe like it's going to be easier to believe that you're crazy and less painful to believe that you're crazy than to like really acknowledge all the shit that you went through and how manipulated and abandoned and tortured you were. um, it's going to be a natural defense mechanism, but it's one that they completely exploit to really like push you away from healing, which is why I just tell people, I'm like, don't initially just like believe anything ever, whether it's yourself or someone else, saying it, but really just, you have to journal, you have to dialogue, you have to really see um, what helps you manage your PTSD symptoms and heal and everything. And if what you find is that it's improving your life and like, things that may not seem believable, you can find at least some validation for, even sometimes in other people's stories, because you can just be like, yo, this just doesn't happen. I'm having memories of being trafficked or used in rituals and this doesn't happen. And you tune into a podcast like yourself, then suddenly you're like hearing people that feel like they're saying almost word for word, like what you yourself have dealt with, this is the kind of stuff that we need to like, to take ourselves seriously, and stop gaslighting ourselves and everything. And, and to just, I always tell people to just start with like what what you feel, what you're dealing with in flashbacks. You don't have to go digging in your, like a lot of people talk about like, how do I recover memories? Like how do I like I just want to know everything. Like I already have like a a a good amount, or a suspect of XYZ, and it's like, how do I just like hypnosis style, how do I just like break it all open, and it's like I always have to be like things happen in the pace they're supposed to happen based off of like your ability to handle it. And like, on a certain level, like we have to acknowledge that if there's things we don't know, we either are not capable of handling it yet, we are not in a safe situation where we can deal with that information, or there's the level of being like, I want to know, but ultimately it's stuff that you're not going to want to accept about yourself, if you're dealing with forced perpetration. So we have to be honest, like, do we want to know? And really that is where most of the healing comes from, is being able to, get over that shame of being forced into things and being able to be like, okay, I can know these things because I know that I would not have chosen them for myself.
Now, as far as the locations, the systems, the internal worlds that exist, and the parts that are identifying with those before the memories are integrated and they have their specific identities that they truly believe with all their heart, whether that is an animal, whether that's called allied. After you integrate, you've talked about creating sort of different structures and such as a safe room. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about um, how that works after you remember in ways that you can sort of help re-identify and help these parts in you that are identified with the world that they're in sort of integrate into a safer place and a space that sort of, I guess, encompasses the identity of your whole being versus just that part that they were identified with for so long.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, this is kind of like the backbone of my channel, is, and that's mainly just because I'm just trying to share what my experience is in healing, and what I've found is the most powerful, and what most people, Swali's mentioned this as well, find the most helpful in healing, is that you have to kind of um, have the, you've gotten to a point where you're choosing to heal and to face this stuff on a certain level. So you're role modeling for your system, which ultimately is just a bunch of terrified children, that you're willing to be the adult in the situation, and that you're willing to non-judgmentally deal with what it is they're dealing with, even though they have a lot of internalized shame and everything. And we are essentially role modeling that we're the only thing they've ever known as true power, which is programmers. It's like on a certain level, that's what we're becoming for ourselves. It's the point at which, when you're healing, the point at which you're taking your system into your own hands. That you're um, acknowledging what you went through enough, and have realized enough about the memories you have and the parts that you have that have like held it. That's the whole reason you're trying to heal. The whole reason you're in therapy, trying to deal with all your crap. Or maybe not in therapy, but just still trying to find what resources you can to get some help and a more manageable life. That essentially you're going to be you're going to essentially be using the tactics that broke you into fixing you on a certain level. So, and that's also because that's what is going to feel most real to the parts that need to heal. So much of our healing really is about like realizing like, okay, like I can internally create like a safe space. I can internally create like a hospital type area where you can like triage like a something that, if hospitals are scary to you, it's like it could literally be whatever you want because it's your imagination. It could be something like like beautiful and idyllic. It could be in heaven if you want, in clouds or whatever, whatever it is. It's like it's whatever generates this feeling of safety, because your whole system has been built on generating feelings of fear and powerlessness. So you start doing the opposite. You start creating the, whatever internal environment, because most of the time, if you're a survivor, you're going to have an insanely vivid imagination and internal world and all this kind of stuff. Like it's something they fostered a ton in you, like on a certain level. Um, and something you had to have innately too for them to even, program you to begin with. So you have this ability to visualize, to create, these spaces that are, not what they created for you, but essentially what you're creating for yourself, and are creating that feeling of safety and empowerment. And that becomes like the safe space, that you're going to base all of your healing off of, because it's going to be all about bringing in, when you're dealing with a flashback and you're dealing with a part that's sharing the trauma event that they went through, it's like you need to be able to internally comfort them before you really deal with the narrative and are in a strong enough place yourself where you're calm enough to face that information, essentially. And you're going to have ways of, like, doing, it's all mind games that got you there, and you're essentially doing the same thing to get yourself back out of it, is being like, what do I need to feel good in this situation? And to me, a lot of times it's going to be about comforting, the way you would just like any traumatized child, like you would be comforting them with things that a kid likes, and a lot of times physically, I recommend this too for survivors to do. Pick up that stuffed animal, pick up that toy, pick up the, comfort food, as long as you're not, being compulsive about it, the thing, a warm blanket, a certain, you know, I hesitate to say a certain movie, because a lot of times, like, we're attached to certain things for the wrong reason. But, things, coloring book, arts and crafts, this kind of thing that is going to be like, would be grounding for a child, because that's how you have to treat yourself. You're dealing with that part of your mentality. You deal with what that part needs, and what you'll find, externally, internally, and what you're going to find is like that the safe space, it's like it grows, it's like it starts to encompass, as you deal with more parts, more and more of the system. And you can also have abilities, to facilitate communication, like with the meeting room, or different like spaces that you create in your head to be like, to serve specific functions in the same way they created parts to serve specific functions in your system. Now you're going to be able to make areas that are like, okay, like we're dealing with emotional flashback stuff coming up, like what is going to be the first spot that we bring that part to? What are going to be the next steps? And then when you're just dealing with your life as a multiple, having like a meeting room type thing, like I mentioned, is really important, to just have a part of you that you can get all the parts' opinion, so that you're not working against each other, but are making a consensus decision as a team, and not self-sabotaging, because you're able to like acknowledge all the parts' feelings, quell any issues that maybe some young parts have as far as fear and stuff, and acknowledge it, but then, reassure them, and, move on, in the right direction, essentially. But yeah, I mean, that's been like almost my whole experience of healing, all the way down to like the darkest, parts of like the hierarchy, the most buried stuff, is that it's like it's been a slow encroachment of like the system that we've created, that we've wanted, as a whole, and slowly, each step of the way kind of transforming what they built in our head, and transforming it into something that can be positive, and a lot of it too is about, you mentioned skills, you have to give these different parts that have these different skills and these different identities, like a similar outlet in your life, like but a productive one. You have to honor the things that they know, and the urges that they have, but in find a way to do it in a positive way, basically. um yeah.
And I love that you detail so much of this on your channel. I wanted to bring that up on the screen and for you to share anything else that you wanted to about your YouTube. I highly recommend, whether you're an ally, whether you're a therapist, whether you're a survivor, Carrie's channel is just incredible, and it's all framed really positively. It's all solution based, and it's a very clinical way, in my opinion, of looking at a lot of this and like understanding it at its base foundation level, and then climbing up from there and understanding how to work with that information now that you know it. And it's really palatable information. You use a lot of visuals on your channel as well, a lot of art, a lot of graphs, almost like what we looked at today. So I wanted you to just share a little bit more about your channel, and you know, share any videos that you would recommend that could maybe help people understand this episode a little bit more and just talk sort of a little bit about your mission with what you're doing on here because it's great.
Yeah. So this really is just uh probably the first step in my healing before I started really even dealing with getting a handle on all the mental health symptoms was getting sober, and being part of AA. And I really, through that model, learned a lot about how important it is that we, like, if you've made it to a certain space in healing, like, how important it is that you give that back essentially to other people that are suffering in the same way. In part because it feels like a moral obligation, and then another part is because it helps to keep me solution focused and oriented and focused on healing and moving forward and staying empowered. This is a large part of it as well. um, so this channel was really just, if I could have imagined the channel I wish would have existed, when I very first was like early in healing, like something that took all these concepts that took for me like a lot of therapy, a lot of work with like dissociative experts, a lot of like reading, different books like Allison Miller, for example. I always bring her up. Or It's not Courage to Heal, but it's the Safe Passage to Healing, I think, is the one that deals with ritual abuse, from back in the day. Different resources, they're thick books, they're very big and they're very intimidating, and a lot of them are written for an adult, not a kid. And what we're dealing with mostly is kid parts. So really, that's my whole goal with this channel, is that I'm trying to break things down into like little lectures that hopefully are very like easy to digest, and I try to illustrate with little graphs and stuff that help you visualize, and simplify things that seem very complex, and and then create exercises too. So like we said, there's playlist on there for meditations and how to begin meditation. There's playlists on there for journaling exercises, because that's like the number one tool in your toolbox if you're healing, in my opinion. Um, so that's really 100% like why I created this specific channel. I had my own motivations for sharing my testimony on your podcast, and others was because I need to honor those that didn't make it, and the experience I went through as a kid. I don't do a whole lot of testimony on my own channel other than the interviews I'm posting with other people. My own videos are really just going to be like more of what we did today, where it's something like where we're just trying to simply explain stuff. And maybe I've thought maybe one day I'll put it all into like more of like a kid's book or something like that, to where it's like it can just be everything in one place, very simple and short, with like the exercises, like I said, so that it gives you a way as a survivor, especially new in healing, to have some context for what you're dealing with in your mental health and PTSD symptoms, as well as like some like proactive steps that you can take to feel better.
It's an incredible channel, and you've done such a amazing service to the community, both with going on other podcasts and sharing your testimony and doing long form interviews like what you're doing now, and creating these sort of classroom, um, more clinical type therapeutic episodes that are a little bit shorter, have a lot of information in them, have the exercises. It's just really neat. And I know everybody else really appreciates you too. And I've gotten so much feedback from posting your videos on my own social media of people saying how much these have helped them, these simple things, and how you're able to break it down in a way where it's like, oh, okay, I can create a safe space. I can create a little's place. These things can be really helpful for especially survivors just coming out of all of this, like how you said you wish you had that type of resource. There's not, and there's starting to be more people that, talk about this a little bit more focused on different channels, but there really isn't a lot of resources where you can get a lot just in one place. You sort of have to search for something here and something there, read this book and then read that book. And It's always really appreciated whenever creators can just put a bunch of information in one place and make it sort of easy and you can just flow through. So I really encourage you guys to go follow Carrie's YouTube channel. It's at Carrie Olaje, or you can type in Desert Dakini, that's Dakini, and it should populate right up. Whenever you just type in Desert Dakini, that should come right up. And also her name is kind of unique. So you'll either get her interviews whenever you pull up her name. And if you scroll down, her channel will eventually come up too if it doesn't come up first. So I really encourage you guys to subscribe. I'm going to have the link in the show notes too to make it easy for you guys. If you're on your phone or on your computer, just go into the show notes underneath this episode and it should turn up like a hyperlink. And you can just click that link right from your phone as you're listening to this episode, and it'll take you right to her channel, and you guys can go subscribe. And Carrie, is there anything else that you wanted to cover today that we didn't get to? I really think we can do a part two and talk more in depth about some other things as well. Get some questions from people, and then, dive into some other aspects of this topic because it is such a really big topic. But for today, was there anything else that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about, or anything that you wanted to close on today?
Um, no, I mean, I definitely think that if people want to submit questions, I think that would probably be like the most helpful thing, both for like me to know where to focus, but then also for everyone out there, if like you're a survivor and you have specific questions, if you're a ally and there's just certain concepts that like you're still trying to, understand the mechanics of how certain things work, I think that would be great. That's kind of what I'm here for, is just to, especially in this kind of episode, is just to, just to see if I can either help survivors break through that next wall in their own healing and to get some peace, or if it's allies, just to help you conceptualize something that might have been difficult to before. Um, so yeah, and then also it's like I feel bad. I've been meaning to do a Q&A on my own channel forever, but it's like I was planning on today, but then we changed the time a little bit of bringing up questions because I've had a lot of great questions from survivors on my own channel that I haven't been able to quite get to answering yet because I'm a little verbose. Um, but so this kinds of things where I could get really specific for sure. I would totally love that. And then just the other thing I would want to say is just to thank you, Emma, again for, giving me a platform to share my testimony today, to just share something that I hope will be helpful for some people, and some survivors in your community. um, it's something I really value, and you really can't put a price on it. I recently did another interview. I've done a few with Sean McCann, who is a Wake the Dead, who is like very he's very compassionate and patient, as well as far as like interviewer goes. But I also branched out and did one with Greg Harwood on the Higher Side Chats recently. If people want to check that out, and I really applaud his courage, for being a little bit more general in like alternative media type thing and willing to put someone like me on. He had Gray on, and then myself, I reached out to him. I've been a long time listener. But it's not like this. It's not like reaching out to the survivor community. It's something I felt like I still needed to do because we do need more voices in those areas that are going to help people to understand. And like I said, I really applaud his courage and interest in being able to like have me on and talk about things. But it's also difficult when you have something so complex and a shorter amount of time to deal with stuff. Whereas like I feel like on your podcast it's probably like, I don't know, like 15 or 16 hours, like who knows, you know what I mean? Because there's so many aspects to this, and it is so complex, that it's like what you've created is so unique and so insanely helpful and beautiful, and just those just way that you can hold space for myself and other survivors is just out of this world. And hats off to Greg too. I plugged you on that podcast. Hopefully he can have more people in his vein, as well that will also show him. But we're always going to have to direct people to this podcast because it's like you have this body of work where you've just provided space and like a sacred space you said in the beginning in the intro, for survivors to just really um, share what they need to heal and to feel heard, and maybe some sense of justice. So I just really wanted to I just wanted to thank you.
And thank you, Carrie. For one, that means a lot to me. And for two, it's incredible that somebody like you and others who have come on have had the courage to do that. It takes a podcast host that has a lot of courage to host somebody who's going to talk about these hard things. But, I think most importantly, it takes even more courage to come forth and talk about these really hard things in your life. And you do it in a one-of-a-kind way that people appreciate so much. And it adds so much more to the puzzle with the visceral and visual aspects that you give with the ways that you can condense such a complexity into something so simple that we can all take with us and understand finally and have those light bulbs go off. So thank you for your courage to continue to show up and to keep sharing what you're learning on your journey. It's incredible to watch you grow. I'm so excited to see what God has for you coming up and, all the different ways that you're going to continue to help this community. Because I know even though you've been doing podcasts now for a little bit, I still feel like you're just dipping your toe in the water for what's to come for you. So we're all really lucky that we get to learn from you, and I hope that you keep creating. And I look forward to doing a part two with you and having you on a million more times and to watching you grow. So thank you so much for coming on and for all that you've contributed to this community with the way that you have this very groundbreaking and remarkable way of presenting testimony. It's really beautiful and wonderful, and it's made a huge impact on people. I can't tell you the amount of people that just absolutely love you with all their heart, and the amount of people that request you to come on, the numbers that your episodes have done and did, especially on my last channel. It's reached some really incredible numbers with, the how small my channel was in comparison to some of these bigger channels, and your episodes were getting numbers, views as if I was a huge channel. So it was really neat to see that people gravitated towards your episodes so much. So for people listening, again, I'm going to have Carrie's YouTube in the show notes. Please share it with people that I think we're all coming in contact more and more with people who are in need of healing and who are very confused about things that they went through growing up. And Carrie's YouTube is a really great resource, again, for people on any level, and especially if you're an ally, a survivor, a therapist, somebody who's interested in this. It's a gold mine of information, and she uploads new videos whenever she has time. Then you can also get a glimpse of some of her other interviews that she's done on other channels on there that she's graciously uploaded for us, such as Wake the Dead. Some of her interviews on there are also on her channel. So please go share this episode, share Carrie's content, go support her, go lift her up. If you guys do have questions on what we talked about today or ways that we can expand this dialogue on part two, please leave your comments below, or I have my email below. You guys can go ahead and reach out to me there if you guys have some questions. You can also obviously go comment on Carrie's YouTube channel, leave her some love and help boost her algorithm. So there's multiple ways you guys can get a hold of us, and it would be really fun to get to answer some of your questions next time in regards to programming, systems, deprogramming even, and healing. And then also some of the more detailed elements that we talked about, such as military mind control, trauma-based mind control, SRA, MK Ultra type programs. So any questions that you guys have, please feel free to contribute. We want to make sure that, we're tailoring a lot of this information to what you guys want to know. I'll have all my information in the show notes as well. Please connect with me wherever you can. And just thank you guys from the bottom of my heart for all your support and love, and for lifting amazing warriors like Carrie up the way that you guys do. It's beautiful, and it's so appreciated to have your support. So you guys, thank you so much for listening. God bless you all, and we will see you next time.